In a quiet village, a happy little family lived in peace until a single choice invited darkness into their home.
I have taken my revenge.
A small brown dog lived with a humble family. The wife, Mary, worked as the village schoolteacher. Her husband, Daniel, spent long days in the fields, planting and harvesting. They were poor, but they shared a happy life. Their tiny wooden house stood near the edge of the fields, and in the evenings the three of them, Mary, Daniel, and the dog they called Buddy, would sit outside watching the sunset while Daniel told funny stories. Buddy would wag his tail and rest his head on Mary's lap, feeling safe and loved. Life in the village moved slowly. Neighbors greeted each other in the mornings, children ran barefoot on the dusty roads, and farmers worked side by side. Buddy followed Daniel to the fields every morning and waited patiently until his master returned. The family did not have much money, but they had peace, love, and respect from the villagers. That peace was broken one day when a rich man named Victor arrived in the village. He wore clean white suits, drove a shiny black car, and always smiled in a way that felt both friendly and cold at the same time. Victor wanted to run in the upcoming local election. He had enough money to buy banners and pay for big speeches, but he didn't have the trust of the villagers. People thought he was clever and ambitious, but not truly kind. One afternoon, Victor came to Mary and Daniel's home. Mary had just returned from the school with her books in her arms. Daniel was repairing a fence near the small vegetable garden. Buddy barked once, but then sat quietly as if sensing that this was an important visit. Victor smiled warmly and told Mary that she should run for the election instead of him. He said the villagers knew her well, respected her as a teacher, and would surely vote for her. At first, Mary was surprised and a little hesitant. She had never imagined entering politics. But Victor's words sounded reasonable. He said he only wanted the best for the village and that she could bring real change. Daniel, trusting his wife's goodness, supported her decision. Buddy wagged his tail as if he, too, approved, though he could not understand the meaning of elections. Weeks passed, and the election day arrived. The entire village came out to vote. The air was filled with excitement and hope. When the results were announced that evening, Mary had won by a large margin. Daniel hugged her tightly, proud of her. Buddy barked happily and ran in circles. The villagers cheered for their new leader, and for a short time, it felt as if a new dawn had come for the small village. Victor came to their house that night, bringing a box of sweets. He congratulated Mary with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He praised her victory, saying that together they could do great things for the village. But as the night grew darker and they sat at the wooden table, Victor leaned closer and spoke in a quieter voice. He told Mary that now she had power, and power could be used to make money. He suggested small favors, approving land for his businesses, allowing certain deals to pass quietly, things that would bring him profit. Mary's face grew serious. She shook her head firmly and said she had entered the election to serve the people, not to steal from them. Daniel nodded beside her in agreement. Victor's smile faded, and his eyes hardened for a brief moment before he masked them again with a polite grin. He left their home, but the warmth in his voice had vanished. The next weeks turned uneasy. Strange troubles began to happen. One evening, the electricity in Mary and Daniel's house was suddenly cut off, even though they had paid their bills. They spent the night by candlelight, while Buddy lay at their feet, ears twitching at every sound outside. Another day, Daniel found the main road blocked by a cart and a few rough men who refused to move it until he turned back. Sometimes, when Mary walked to the school, a couple of Victor's men lingered nearby, whispering insults under their breath. Mary stayed strong. She kept working for the people, refusing to sign any papers that would allow corruption. Daniel supported her quietly, standing like a steady wall beside her. But the pressure from Victor increased. His men spread rumors about Mary in the market. They laughed at Daniel in the fields. At night, Buddy sometimes growled low, hearing footsteps in the dark beyond the fence. Still, the family held on to each other and to their sense of right and wrong. One rainy evening, Daniel and Mary were returning from a village meeting. The narrow road was slippery, and the rain came down in thin, cold sheets. Buddy trotted beside them, shaking the water off his back now and then. A truck's headlights appeared in the distance. It was coming too fast for the wet road. Daniel held Mary's hand and moved her to the side, but the truck swerved sharply toward them as if driven with cruel intent. Buddy barked loudly and jumped forward, trying to warn them. The truck hit Daniel first. The sound of the impact was terrible. Mary screamed as they both fell. Buddy lunged at the truck, snapping at its tires, but the driver sped away into the darkness. Villagers came running with lanterns, their faces pale with shock. They carried Mary, who was barely conscious, to the small clinic in the village. Daniel's injuries were too severe. By the time they reached the clinic, his breathing had stopped. Mary slipped into a deep coma, her hand falling limp from the nurse's grasp. Buddy sat outside the clinic all night, drenched in rain, his fur muddy and matted. He did not move, not even to eat or drink. His dark eyes were fixed on the door, as if waiting for his family to come out and take him home. Tears mixed with the rain on his face, though no one could tell the difference. The villagers tried to call him away, but he refused. He stayed there, as still as a stone, except for the slight shiver that went through his body whenever the cold wind blew. The next morning, the sun rose weakly through gray clouds. The doctor came out and shook his head at the gathered villagers. Mary's condition was uncertain. She might wake up, or she might never return to the life she had known. Buddy let out a low, mournful whine and lowered his head. The once happy little family was broken, and only the loyal dog remained to remember the warmth of their evenings together. In that moment, the peaceful life they had cherished was gone, and a long road of struggle lay ahead. For many days after the accident, Buddy stayed near the small clinic. He waited outside the door, as if Mary might walk out and call his name. The nurses sometimes put a bowl of water for him, but he hardly touched it. He had lost his master, and the gentle voice of Mary was gone. When the doctors finally moved Mary to a city hospital, the villagers loaded her into an old ambulance. Buddy chased the ambulance as far as the edge of the village, but he could not keep up. He stood on the muddy road, barking and crying until the sound of the siren faded. Then he lowered his head and began to walk, step by step, toward the distant city. The journey took days. Buddy crossed dusty roads, fields, and small towns. He had no one to guide him, only the scent of the road and the memory of Mary. By the time he reached the city, his fur was dirty and tangled, his paws were sore, and his ribs showed through his thin body. The city was loud and crowded. Cars honked, people hurried past, and no one paid attention to a lonely village dog. Buddy wandered near the courthouse square, where food vendors threw away leftovers at night. Hungry and tired, he dug through the piles of trash, pulling out scraps of bread and bones. Sometimes he found nothing and went to sleep on the cold pavement with an empty stomach. The people in the city were not like the kind villagers he had known. When they saw the dirty dog near the garbage, they wrinkled their noses and laughed. Children sometimes pointed and shouted. A group of young men who spent their days leaning against the wall near the courthouse began to mock him. They called him names and threw small stones to scare him away. One evening, as Buddy tried to eat a piece of bread he had found, a boy kicked the bread into the gutter. Another boy picked up a pebble and tossed it at him. Buddy flinched but did not run. He lowered his head, quietly moved to another corner, and tried to find something else to eat. The city was harsh, but he had nowhere else to go. Life went on like this for weeks. Every morning, Buddy roamed the streets searching for food. Every night, he curled up under a broken wooden cart near the courthouse. He grew thinner and weaker, but there was still a spark in his eyes. One day, while searching for something to eat, he reached a narrow street at the edge of the marketplace. At the far end of the street, there was a large garbage spot. People from the neighborhood brought their trash in plastic bags and threw it there before going back to their homes. The place smelled bad, and flies buzzed everywhere. Near the garbage, there was a small shop that sold tea and snacks. The shop belonged to an old man named Samuel. Every day, Samuel sat behind the wooden counter of his shop, waving away the bad smell that drifted from the garbage heap. Buddy often went to that garbage spot to look for food. Samuel noticed the dog from his shop window. At first, he thought of Buddy as just another stray. But after some days, he began to see something different. Buddy never ripped open the garbage bags the way other stray dogs did. Instead, he carefully dragged them to a corner, bit the plastic, and pulled out whatever food he could find. Then one morning, Samuel watched in surprise as Buddy picked up a half-torn garbage bag in his mouth, carried it across the street, and dropped it into a large trash bin farther away. He went back for another bag and dragged that one too. It was as if the dog was trying to clear the place. Samuel watched this quietly for days. Each morning, Buddy came to the garbage spot. If someone threw a bag onto the street, Buddy would drag it away to the bin. Slowly, the area in front of the shop started to look a little cleaner. The smell was not as strong as before. Samuel felt a strange warmth in his chest whenever he saw the dog working. The neighbors also began to notice. Some laughed, saying the dog was silly. But others smiled and shook their heads in wonder. One sunny afternoon, as Buddy was dragging a torn bag, he stopped suddenly. Across the street, he saw a small garden with bright flowers blooming. The breeze carried a sweet scent from the garden. Buddy tilted his head as if thinking. He trotted to the edge of the garden and carefully picked a small flower in his mouth. He carried it back to the garbage spot. There, using his paws, he scratched a small hole in the dirt and placed the flower inside. Then he pushed the soil gently over the stem. He sat down beside it for a moment, his tail wagging slowly. Samuel watched the scene, his mouth slightly open in surprise. The next morning, Buddy did the same thing again. He went to the garden, brought another flower, dug a tiny hole in the dirt near the first one, and planted it. Day after day, he repeated this little act. Gradually, small colorful patches began to appear around the once ugly garbage place. People who came to throw their trash would pause and look at the flowers. Some even hesitated to toss their garbage there, not wanting to ruin the little garden. Weeks passed. Buddy continued to clear the garbage and plant flowers. The narrow street began to change. The bad smell faded, replaced by the soft fragrance of blossoms. The neighbors started to feel proud of their street. Children would come by in the afternoons to watch Buddy work. Some of them began to bring small flowers to plant beside him. Samuel started keeping a bowl of water and a little food for Buddy near the shop. He often spoke to the dog in a gentle voice, though Buddy only tilted his head and wagged his tail in reply. One evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops, Samuel stepped out of his shop and knelt beside Buddy. He gently stroked the dog's rough fur and said, "You're not just a stray anymore. You've given this street a new life." From that day on, Buddy no longer slept under the broken cart near the courthouse. Samuel made a small bed for him beside the shop. The neighbors began to greet the dog in the mornings. Some patted his head when they passed by. A few even brought him bits of bread or meat. The dog who had once been mocked and stoned was now loved and respected. The story of the flower-planting dog spread to other parts of the city. People came to see him. Some took pictures with their phones. Buddy didn't care about the attention. He still spent his mornings dragging away the trash and his afternoons planting small flowers in the clean patches of soil. By the time the next season came, the entire street had changed. The once dirty, smelly place had become bright with colors and filled with the scent of flowers. The neighbors often said it felt as if hope itself had come to live among them. Samuel sometimes sat on a bench outside his shop in the cool evenings, watching Buddy rest peacefully at his feet. He often wondered about the dog's past, about the sadness that sometimes lingered in his eyes when the night grew quiet. He didn't know about the village, the field, or the family Buddy had lost. But he felt certain that this dog had carried not only his grief, but also his kindness all the way to the city. In the heart of the bustling streets, Buddy had turned pain into something gentle and beautiful. And the people who once mocked him now saw in him a quiet hero who had taught them the value of care and small acts of goodness. The city had changed since Buddy arrived. The garbage-filled street had become clean and bright with flowers. People smiled more often, children played without fear of stepping into piles of trash, and Samuel's little shop had become a meeting place for neighbors who liked to talk about how a stray dog had transformed their lives. Buddy now slept in a soft bed beside the shop's door and was fed with care every day. Yet, even after all the changes, he would often sit quietly at night, his eyes drifting toward the sky, as if remembering the family he had lost. One morning, Buddy noticed something new. As he wandered near the narrow lanes, he saw that many houses were still old and worn. The paint on their walls had faded, and some parts were stained and cracked. The street was clean now, but the walls around it were dull and lifeless. He stared at them for a long time, his head slightly tilted, as if thinking of what could be done. That afternoon, when Samuel was busy serving tea at his shop, Buddy disappeared for a while. When he returned, he was dragging something awkward with his teeth. It was a half-empty can of paint that had probably been left near a construction site. In his other paw, he clumsily held an old brush. Samuel saw him and stepped outside, curious. To his amazement, Buddy dipped the brush into the paint and began to drag it across a wall near the shop. The lines were uneven, and the brush often slipped from his paw, but there was no mistaking what he was trying to do. Samuel stood there for a moment, astonished. Then, without a word, he hurried into his shop, opened a small wooden box under the counter, and took out the few crumpled bills he had saved. That evening, he went to a hardware store and bought a few cans of fresh paint and better brushes. The next morning, he started painting his own small house, while Buddy watched eagerly, wagging his tail. It took Samuel 2 days to finish. By the time he was done, the dull, stained walls of his house had turned a cheerful, warm color. When the neighbors passed by, they stopped to stare. Samuel's little home looked bright and inviting, like a fresh blossom in spring. Buddy wagged his tail and barked softly, as if encouraging Samuel. Then he trotted over to the other houses on the street and looked at their walls. He sat down in front of one house and gave a short bark. Then he looked back at Samuel and wagged his tail again, as if to say, "This one next." Samuel laughed softly and shook his head. "I know what you want, boy," he said, "but I can't paint the whole street myself." That evening, Samuel gathered the neighbors. He stood under the small lamppost in the street with Buddy sitting beside him. Samuel told everyone about the dog's wish, that Buddy wanted to see the whole street bright and beautiful. The neighbors laughed at first. Some even shook their heads, thinking the old man had lost his mind. But Samuel did not argue. Instead, he pointed to his freshly painted house. The neighbors looked at it carefully. The colors glowed under the soft streetlight, and for a moment, the street looked as if it belonged to a happier, richer place. The neighbors fell silent. One of them finally said, "If a dog can dream of a better street, maybe we should try too." Soon, the neighbors started buying paint for their own homes. Some of them painted by themselves, while others asked Samuel for advice. Buddy often sat nearby, wagging his tail and watching them work as if supervising the transformation. In a few weeks, the entire street looked different. The once dull walls now shone in soft shades of blue, green, and cream. The houses looked fresh, and the people felt proud. But there was still something missing. The walls along the main street were still gray and dirty. One evening, Samuel stood with a few neighbors near his shop and said, "We've painted our homes, but what about the street walls? If we can collect a little money together, maybe we can paint them too." The neighbors agreed. Everyone chipped in a small amount, and soon they had enough to buy paint for the street. They also hired a young local artist to make something special. Over the next few weeks, the artist painted beautiful murals on the walls, green hills, flowers, birds, and on every wall, a small sketch of Buddy. The street that had once smelled of garbage now looked like a cheerful outdoor gallery. People passing by slowed down to look. Many even stopped to take pictures. The city's mayor heard about the transformation and entered the street into the annual Most Beautiful Neighborhood competition. When the results came in, their street won first prize. Reporters and photographers arrived to cover the story. They took pictures of the colorful houses, the murals, the old man who had supported the dog's dream, and of course Buddy himself. The story spread across newspapers and social media. Visitors from other parts of the city started coming to see the famous Flower Street, often kneeling to take photos beside Buddy, who watched them quietly, his tail sweeping the ground. Life was peaceful and hopeful again, until one morning, a familiar face appeared. Victor, the wealthy politician who had once ruined Buddy's village family, came to the city. He had seen the news about the famous street and realized that this place now had the power to influence votes. Victor had become a powerful political figure and was preparing to run in the upcoming presidential election. He believed that if he gained the support of this neighborhood, his chances would rise even higher. Victor arrived in a shiny black car and walked into Samuel's shop with a practiced smile. He praised the beauty of the street, admired the murals, and then offered Samuel a generous amount of money. He told Samuel that he wanted the support of the street's people in the election. Samuel hesitated at first, but the promise of money to improve the neighborhood even further tempted him. Finally, he nodded and shook Victor's hand. Buddy, who had been lying quietly near the shop's door, suddenly stood up. His ears went back, and he began to bark fiercely, his eyes fixed on Victor. The sharp sound startled Samuel. Victor frowned slightly, but kept his smile. He patted his suit jacket as if brushing away dust and then left, saying he would return soon. When Victor's car disappeared down the street, Samuel turned to Buddy and said gently, "We'll work together with him. You're the hero here, and people trust you. If you stand by me, the whole neighborhood will support his campaign." But Buddy only barked again, louder and more urgently this time. He paced back and forth, then stopped in front of Samuel, staring into his eyes with a look that seemed almost human in its warning. Samuel sighed and shook his head. "You don't understand politics," he said softly. "This is good for our street." In the following days, Samuel began to help Victor's team organize campaign events in the street. Posters were hung on the freshly painted walls, and Victor's face smiled down from every corner. Samuel often tried to keep Buddy beside him during the speeches, thinking that the sight of the famous dog would win more hearts. But Buddy always pulled away. Each time they tried to lead him to the campaign stage, he slipped from the leash or walked off in the opposite direction. Sometimes he barked during Victor's speeches, drawing puzzled looks from the crowd. The neighbors, who had admired Buddy for so long, noticed his strange behavior. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the dog sensed something they could not see. But for now, most of them still trusted Samuel's decision. Only Buddy remained restless and watchful, his eyes following Victor whenever he visited, his growl low and steady as if warning of a danger yet to come. The day of the election arrived. The whole city buzzed with excitement. Colorful flags waved on the rooftops, posters fluttered in the morning breeze, and people lined up early at the polling stations. Samuel stood near the center of the famous street with Buddy sitting beside him. His heart beat fast. He had never imagined that a poor old shopkeeper would have a role in a national election. The neighbors came one by one to vote, smiling at Samuel, patting Buddy's head as they passed. By noon, the streets were crowded with voters, and everywhere people whispered about what the results might bring. Victor's campaign workers moved around with confident smiles. They believed they had the votes they needed. The election day ended with a shocking twist. When the results were announced that night, Samuel had won by a clear margin. Actually, one day, while Victor's men prepared for one last rally, Buddy suddenly leapt up and began to run down the street. His bark was sharp and urgent. Samuel called out to him, startled, then began to chase after him. The crowd laughed at the sight of the old man running after the famous dog, but soon they lost interest and returned to their waiting. Buddy ran as fast as his strong legs would carry him, weaving through traffic, crossing busy roads, and heading toward the edge of the city. Samuel followed as best he could, breathless but determined. After what felt like a long chase, Buddy slowed down as he passed a large hospital building. He stopped suddenly and stared at a man who had just stepped out of the hospital gate. The man was in his late 40s, with a sun-worn face that lit up in surprise the moment his eyes fell on Buddy. "Buddy," the man whispered, almost not believing what he saw. Buddy's ears perked up. He sniffed the air, then let out a soft, broken whine. The next second, he bounded forward and pressed his head against the man's legs. The man knelt down, his eyes wet, and wrapped his arms around the dog. Passers-by slowed to watch the strange reunion. Tears rolled down the man's cheeks as he stroked Buddy's rough fur. It was Mary's cousin, a farmer from the same village Buddy had come from. He had come to the city to visit Mary in the hospital. As he held Buddy close, he said in a trembling voice, "I can't believe it's you. We thought we lost you after the accident." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes shining with both sadness and joy. He barked softly, as if telling the man everything he had been through. The cousin looked around and saw Samuel approaching, out of breath. "This is your dog?" he asked, confused. Samuel shook his head slowly. "He's been living with me for some time. I didn't know he had a family." The cousin smiled faintly through his tears. "He belonged to Mary and Daniel. Daniel died in the accident, and Mary has been in a coma since that night. She's here. Come. You both should see her." Samuel's eyes widened. He finally understood why Buddy had barked so furiously whenever Victor appeared, why the dog had never seemed at peace. Without a word, he followed the cousin into the hospital. Buddy trotted ahead, leading them straight to a quiet room at the end of the hallway. Inside, Mary lay on a bed, pale and still, with tubes and monitors surrounding her. The soft beeping of a heart monitor filled the room. The moment Buddy stepped inside, his tail slowed, and he lowered his head. His paws moved softly across the floor until he reached the side of the bed. He placed his chin gently on the edge of the blanket, his eyes glistening. For a moment, he didn't move at all, as if afraid that even a breath might disturb her fragile rest. Samuel stood silently at the door, his own eyes moist. He felt a deep ache in his heart as he watched the dog who had transformed an entire city now sitting so small and broken before the woman he loved and lost. Mary's cousin quietly explained everything to Samuel, the life Mary and Daniel had shared, their dreams for the village, Victor's corruption, the tragedy of the accident, and Buddy's loyalty. Samuel listened in silence, his face growing grimmer as the pieces fell into place. At last he whispered, "Now I understand why he could never trust Victor." After some time, Samuel knelt beside Buddy and stroked his head. "I'm sorry, boy," he said softly. "I didn't know. I promise I'll make this right." The next day, Samuel returned to the city, his mind heavy with the truth. He called a meeting of the neighbors and told them the whole story, how Buddy had once belonged to Mary, how Victor had betrayed her family, and how the dog had been trying to warn them all along. The people listened in stunned silence. Some of them wiped tears from their eyes. When Samuel finished, there was a long pause before one of the neighbors stood up and said, "We cannot support Victor. Not after this." Word spread quickly across the city. The excitement that had once surrounded Victor's campaign turned to suspicion and anger. People who had planned to vote for him began to change their minds. They came together in the square and declared that they would not be used by a corrupt man. Instead, they would put forward their own candidate, a man who had worked for the good of the people without asking for anything in return. They chose Samuel. Victor was furious when he heard the news. He tried to rally his supporters, but the tide had turned. The city that had once been his hope for votes now stood firmly behind Samuel and the dog they had come to love. The election day ended with a shocking twist. When the results were announced that night, Samuel had won by a clear margin. The crowd in the square erupted in cheers. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. Samuel stood on the steps of the city hall, holding Buddy close to his side. Cameras flashed as he raised his hand and said, "This victory is not mine. It belongs to this dog, our friend, our guide, and our hero." The people cheered louder. Some shouted Buddy's name. For the first time in years, the street that had once smelled of garbage now echoed with hope and pride. A few days later, Samuel made good on his promise. He arranged for a helicopter to take him and Buddy to the distant village where it had all begun. The villagers gathered in the fields, shading their eyes as they watched the helicopter descend. Children pointed excitedly, whispering, "It's Buddy. The hero dog is coming home." The helicopter landed softly on the open field near Mary's house. As soon as the door opened, Buddy leapt down. His tail wagged wildly as he ran across the familiar ground. The villagers watched in awe, many with tears in their eyes, as the dog they had thought lost returned like a hero from a storybook. Samuel stepped out of the helicopter, smiling gently, and followed Buddy into the quiet house. Inside, Mary's relatives had prepared a chair for her near the window. With the doctor's permission, they had brought her home for a while to recover, hoping the familiar surroundings might awaken something in her. Buddy padded softly into the room. The moment he saw her, his ears perked, and he let out a low, gentle whine. Slowly, he walked up to her chair and rested his head on her knee. Mary's eyes fluttered open slightly. Her lips trembled, as if trying to form a word. A single tear slipped down her cheek. The room grew silent except for the sound of Buddy's quiet whimper. Samuel stood by the door, his heart full, as he watched the long-separated friends reunite. The villagers crowded outside the window, some of them wiping their eyes. In that small, sunlit room, it felt as though hope had returned to the village.